everyone, welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I'm continuing my Lit 101 series with a compare and contrast. I'm going to be looking at two poems that are about vaguely similar themes, and we're going to be sort of pitting the poems against each other and seeing what things are similar, what things are different, to see what we can learn about them. So first off, the question is sort of, why do we compare and contrast anyways? Can't you just read a poem and then you get to the end and you're like, okay, I've read that poem. Like, why do you need to take two poems and look at them sort of side by side? Again, all of this is in service of critical thinking and getting our minds to sort of make connections that we wouldn't otherwise make. And so when you have two poems that are either very similar or very different, and you look at them side by side, sometimes your brain is able to make connections between the themes or the imagery or something about the poems that you wouldn't normally see. It's kind of like if you're looking at a picture and you're just looking at it inside with kind of the light the way it is normally, and then you go outside in like the sunlight and you look at the picture again, maybe it looks different. Maybe you notice things you didn't notice before. Maybe the colors stand out more. It's all about sort of changing your perspective and giving your brain another way to look at something to encourage unique, interesting observations that you wouldn't normally go. Again, critical thinking is the kind of the main reason why we do any kind of analysis or deep reading of something. It's not just in favor of torturing you because we want you to read deeply all the time and just hurt your brain doing it. It's because we want your brain to be used to sort of picking out details, making connections, seeing why things are the way they are, seeing how things interact with other things to contribute to the whole effect of something. It's just basically we want you to be better at observing the world and reading critically and making connections and being able to sort of logic your way through things better. So with that aside, let's dive into the poems. I've picked two poems. They were written about 10 years apart. One was written by an Irish poet and the other was written by a African-American poet. So it's going to be very, very different styles, but I think they work really well together. So the poems I'm going to be looking at are The Wild Swans at Coole by William Butler Yeats and Poème d'automne, or Poème d'automne, it's French, I can't pronounce that right, by Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was a big member of the Harlem Renaissance. He was a great sort of artistic force. He was really good at blending sort of the music and culture and language of his community into his poems. They have a very vibrant, kind of authentic feel to them. And William Butler Yeats was a modernist poet. He was writing in Ireland and England and all around there. He was very much concerned with sort of the link between the past and the present. He was also very concerned with sort of the language and folk tales and music of sort of his Irish heritage, and he kind of engages with that in a lot of his poems. And there's cool stuff to be found in each of these poems, and I'm really excited. So let's dive right in. I'm going to start with the Hughes poem. This is my collection of Langston Hughes works. It doesn't actually have this poem in it because it's the selected works, not the collected works like I was originally looking for. But that's okay, because this is still a good collection. Hughes is a wonderful poet. His stuff, a lot of his poems are kind of short and snappy, so you can read a lot of them on your own. You can find a lot of his poems for free on the poets.org website, and so read his work, get used to it. There's cool stuff in there, and I'd love to study just like every single poem he ever wrote. This poem I got from poets.org, so I'm going to be reading it from their website. So let's read the poem first, and then we'll kind of dig into it and do kind of a once-over of the poem. The autumn leaves are too heavy with color. The slender trees on the Vulcan road are dressed in scarlet and gold, like young courtesans waiting for their lovers. But soon the winter winds will strip their bodies bare, and then the sharp, sleet-stung caresses of cold will be their only love. All right, I love this poem so much. So it seems to be pretty simple at first. It's a short poem, and it's got kind of a main focus on like autumn to winter. That seems to be kind of what he's talking about. It's split into two parts. The first part begins with sort of the autumn leaves, and there's a hinge point in the middle of the poem where it says, "but soon." Many scholars call that a turn, and you see this in a lot of different types of poems. In the poem we looked at last week, Ozymandias, there's a turn in that poem as well, where you get to the end and there's kind of this switch between the kind of dramatic, epic feel of the inscription on the statue, and then it goes to sort of, it pulls back the camera and we see that it's sort of just a lone broken statue in the middle of nothing, and there's desert all around, and it's sort of forgotten and empty, and it's sort of lost its meaning. And so the turn in a poem is where you have sort of, this is the way things are, but it looks at it in another way, or it takes it in a new direction, or it changes the focus somehow. The turn in poetry is really a cool technique that you'll see in a lot of things. It's a way to sort of take something and then it pulls the rug out from under you and forces you to look at it in a different way. And so in this poem, the turn starts with "but then," and then it goes into part 2, which starts "the winter winds." And the focus here is you've got the winter winds are sort of pulling the autumn leaves from the trees and leaving them sort of bare and cold and exposed. Now, poetry is cool because it allows the poet to sort of do two things at once. So on first glance, it's just looking at the trees on this street, kind of on either side of the street. They've got the gold and the red and the yellow leaves. They're really beautiful. And then the winter winds come along and they rip all the leaves off the trees and leave them sort of bare and cold. But there's something else going on here, and it's the simile that he uses of the courtesans. At first he describes the trees as richly colored, as he says, like courtesans waiting for their lovers. That's something interesting too, because he could have just said people dressed up, to go out in the town, but he specifically mentions courtesans dressing up to meet their lovers. And a courtesan is sort of a high-paid escort or a sex worker. Think Moulin Rouge. That's, kind of where that goes. That's a very melodramatic example, but that's sort of the image here. And so the idea is that this is sort of a high-paid escort for the upper class. And there's kind of a weird thing going on here, because at first you think, when you look at just the weather and the nature imagery, you've got everything's great in fall, and then the leaves pull off, and then it's cold and sad in winter. But there's something kind of else going on. There's a darker element kind of lurking beneath the poem. And you can see that in the way that he describes the effect of kind of the winter on the trees. Because you've got this image of these courtesans who are sort of being stripped and neglected and forgotten, and at the very end it says the sharp sleet-stung caresses of cold will be their only love, and love on its own is on its own line at the very, very bottom. And that's kind of bleak. It's really kind of meant to hammer home that the love that he's talking about is a sort of hollow, empty sort of love. And so there's different ways you can look at this. Is he jealous of the wealthy people who are, they have so much that they can pay for companionship? Is he critical of the upper classes for this sort of empty relationship where they pay for companionship but it doesn't mean anything? And it's sort of this assumption that sort of the upper classes are sort of incapable of meaningful relationships, and it's all just facade and emptiness. Or is he talking about sort of, no matter how fun and attractive companionship like this feels, in the end it's always going to be sort of hollow and empty and sad? So there's a lot of ways you can look at this. There's different approaches you can look at it, but the speaker has kind of an anger to him in this sort of image. It's not that he's sort of sad that things are changing. It's almost like he's sort of angry at the status quo, and looking at the loss and emptiness that comes of this is sort of almost like a gotcha. It's almost like an "I told you so." Did you honestly think love was real, or that it was something that you could just pay for? And there's different ways to look at it for sure, but this is definitely a poem that sort of, he uses this image, and he's just talking about trees, but below that there's this image of these courtesans of, there's all this sort of expectation and promise of fun and beauty and connection, and then the facade is stripped away and all the clothes are pulled off, and what you're left with is sort of this empty, hollow love that doesn't mean anything. So there's definitely something going on with the speaker in how he's relating to this image. And he's talking about trees, but he's using the image of the trees to say something else about society, relationships, or just relationships among the upper class, or the treatment of women, and the kind of the way that people are used and discarded. There's lots in here, even though it's a short poem. But another way that we can look at this is by comparing it to another poem. So now we're going on to The Wild Swans at Coole by William Butler Yeats. And we'll return to the Hughes poem later, but right now we're going to look at something that's talking about something sort of similar. We've still got the kind of autumn setting, but it's a very different kind of poem. So in this one, I do actually have the collected works of Yeats because I love him so much. And so we're going to read through this poem. All right, The Wild Swans at Coole. The trees are in their autumn beauty, the woodland paths are dry, under the October twilight the water mirrors a still sky. Upon the brimming water among the stones are 59 swans. The 19th autumn has come upon me since I first made my count. I saw, before I had well finished, all suddenly mount and scatter, wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. I have looked upon those brilliant creatures, and now my heart is sore. All's changed since I, hearing at twilight the first time on the shore, the bell beat of their wings above my head, trod with a lighter tread. Unwearied still, lover by lover, they paddle in the cold, companionable streams, or climb the air, their hearts have not grown old. Passion or conquest, wander where they will, attend upon them still. But now they drift on the still water, mysterious, beautiful, among what rushes will they build? By what lake's edge or pool delight men's eyes when I awake someday to find that they have flown away? This one is also painting an autumn scene, one in which the speaker is looking at the swans on the lake at Coole, which is, today, it's a nature park near Galway, Ireland. And he's come back after 19 years away, and he's looking at the swans and sort of reflecting on what he's seeing and how it makes him feel. Now, if you're wondering, I'm happy to report that the swans at Coole are still there. Now, this poem has a similar turn to Hughes' poem. It starts out very peaceful, idyllic, beautiful, serene, and then there's a turn to sort of a melancholy perspective, because the speaker is sort of saying that, the swans haven't changed, everything is still beautiful as it is, they still are together, and they still have this kind of nobility and beauty about them, but I've changed. The speaker sort of says that since coming back 19 years later, I now kind of walk with, he says, I no longer walk with a lighter tread, which means that he's kind of walks with a sadder kind of gait. He doesn't have the kind of bright, bounciness and what idealism of youth, and he finds that sort of his enjoyment of the scene is sort of affected by the changes that he's gone through in the years since he first came to this part. So there's kind of a tragedy in there where it's sort of, he's looking at sort of the difference between how he saw it before and how he sees it now. And it sort of saddens him that he seems to have so much more on his shoulders now, and he's not really able to sort of enjoy it the way he used to. Now, if we want to look at this just from a structural standpoint, we've got 5 stanzas of 6 lines each, and there's a rhyme scheme of A, B, C, B, D, D, which means that the first and third lines don't rhyme. So that's the A and the C. But the second and third lines do, and the 5th and 6th lines do. So it's got kind of the flow and rhythm of a folk song. Like, you could sing this, it does have the feel of kind of an old Irish folk song. Now, Yeats was very in tune with sort of the folk songs and the folklore of Ireland, and he uses that in his poems a lot. Now, Yeats wasn't a romantic. The romantics were sort of the 19th century, and the romantics were all about sort of nature as the ideal. Nature was sort of where everything made sense. Nature was inspiring. Nature was a place where you could sort of see the divine order of everything. And then, they contrasted that with sort of the urban spaces, which were dirty and people were disconnected from nature. And so, the only way to sort of achieve enlightenment and understand the world was to kind of return to nature. That was the Romantics. The modernists were very different. They were sort of looking for ways to create new ways of thinking, new paradigms that reconciled sort of the fact that they didn't think that there was any sort of natural order. The order was up to people to sort of find a new way to look at things. And Yeats was a modernist, but he's like right at the beginning of it. And so there's a tension in a lot of his works between sort of the old, folklore and folk music and nature and everything, and then the modern day. And there's often kind of a disconnect that happens. And this poem really does a good job of describing it. It was written in like 1916, 1917, and published in 1917. So it was published in June, and World War I ended in November of 1917. So it was written, or it was published about 6 months before the end of World War I. And so that might give us a clue as to this sort of heaviness and depression that the speaker is sort of going through, because you've got sort of nature and the beauty of nature, but then you've got the war going on. And World War I was kind of one of the contributors to sort of modernism. It was sort of a collapse of the natural order and a loss of faith in the systems that sort of protected people and sort of that people had a lot of faith in. And so World War I was sort of this big calamity that shook a lot of people's faith in a lot of things like faith in the church, faith in the government, faith in the natural order of things, because it was just so shocking to so many people, especially in Europe. And so that might be part of what's going on in this poem, is the speaker is sort of saying, what with, kind of everything in the world going on, I find that I can't really appreciate the simple, elegant beauty of the natural world anymore, because my mind is sort of thinking about sort of what's going to happen next. And the war, when it ended, people were left sort of wondering, what now? What are we doing? Modernism is where you see a lot of stylistic changes. That's where you see like Picasso, and you see Igor Stravinsky and his music sort of breaking with tradition and experimenting with very angular, atonal music. Sort of all of the kind of established rules of art were sort of thrown away, and people said, okay, now we're going to find a new way of doing things, because the rules don't matter, so it's up to us to sort of create new rules. And that's kind of what the modernist world was. It's also why modernism is kind of one of my favorite eras, and so I talk about it a lot. So this poem here is using sort of the beauty of nature and the quality of the swans to ask questions about sort of human nature and the kind of human perspective and the way we do things. And the speaker is almost upset that nature is sort of unchanged, because he still says the swans are still beautiful, everything is still wonderful and elegant and perfect, but I've changed and I feel kind of broken and worn down by the events of the world. He doesn't get into specifics, so we don't know if this is meant to be about World War I. It could also be the main character has just aged and dealing with sort of the realities of real life. He's no longer as carefree as he was when he was a young man. So we don't want to kind of assume this is for sure talking about sort of this or that. But the main kind of gist of it is that he's changed as a person as he's grown up, and he finds that sort of the way that he is now is different from the way he was then, and it's affected his ability to just sort of experience awe at the beauty of nature. There's also the sense that Yeats kind of sees nature as something sort of aloof and uncaring, because it's almost like, the swans are still perfect, everything's fine for them, they still have all their passions and their love and everything, but they don't care about, the human realm. And so it's almost like he's almost kind of mad that the swans are still happy and still beautiful and still serene, and they're unaffected by the chaos of the real world. They don't even care that the world has changed or that the speaker's changed. It might even be as far as that. He's just saying, my life has been difficult, but the swan's life is still perfect, and it doesn't matter to them, or I don't matter to them in any way because they're disconnected from that. So you want to kind of look at sort of what you think most resonates with you in terms of the speaker's point of view, because poetry is subjective. There is no sort of one perfect explanation for everything. There are like some facts to be seen, like for sure this poem is about a speaker who is different now than he was, and he's looking at it and finding that it doesn't have the same effect because he's a different person. So that's kind of the facts. But in terms of why he feels different or what he feels about the swans, it's very vague. And that's one thing Yeats does very well, is he kind of paints an emotional picture. So we know that the speaker is experiencing melancholy, maybe even loss, maybe resentment, maybe a sense of disconnection from something, but we don't know specifically why. But we don't have to know specifically why. It's just there's a disconnect between the speaker and what he's seeing, and he feels some kind of way about it, and the poem is sort of painting this sort of melancholic emotional state using the swans as an image. And then the poem ends with the speaker sort of saying, you know, and when is it going to get to the point where the swans just fly away and I won't ever see them again and other people get to enjoy them, kind of thing. So there's a lot in here, and a lot of it is sort of a mirror for the reader. And so it's at first it seems like a pretty simple poem, but it's also a poem that sort of will mean different things to different people depending on how they've dealt with the things that have happened in their lives. If someone is very cynical and very depressed and really struggling, this poem is probably going to hit a lot harder than if someone has had a really wonderful past few years where things have gone really well, they've gotten everything they wanted, and you know, maybe they never really had that sort of connection to something from their past that they're really sort of lamenting the loss of. And that's why I really like this poem, because it's so multifaceted. So when you're looking at these two poems now, you want to ask yourself sort of, okay, how are they the same and how are they different? Because it sort of encourages you to look at connections between the two. Obviously, there's a lot of really surface level elements that are the same. These are both autumn poems. They are both looking at speakers who have grown disenchanted or disconnected from the world around them. There's sort of a darker emotional core to each poem. There's a sense of change from, in the Hughes poem, you've got the change from fall to winter and the metaphor that he kind of creates in there, or the simile that he creates there. And then in the Yeats poem, you've got the change from the past to the present and the change in perspective that brings. Both poets were members of sort of oppressed minorities. The Irish were treated horribly by the English. And of course, Langston Hughes was a black man living in America in, you know, the early 20th century, and things were not good for them at that time either. Both poets used the language and music of their own cultures as a way to look at the world around them and explore how they relate to the world around them. Hughes employs lots of jazz, blues, soul, gospel music in his work. A lot of his poems read like the lyrics of songs or hymns, and Yeats often draws on the rhythms and feel of like folk songs and poetry. Both poems, again, they look at this sense of loss, although what is lost is sort of a little bit different, but both of them look at something that is taken away, and the speakers are sort of angry about how things have changed. Now, looking to contrast the two, this is where we sort of see why they're not different, because you don't want to simplify things. I know a lot of times we want to look at a poem, and once we feel like we've sort of got it, we're like, okay, this poem's about loss. You could put up that ridiculous comic Loss and be like, this is this poem. That's what it is. And that's a really oversimplification. We don't want to do that. So we do want to contrast them as well and see why they're not the same, so we can look at what elements allow them to be telling completely different stories. The first is a pretty simple one. Yeats is looking at a natural space while Hughes is looking at an urban space. he's looking at trees that are kind of lining the road, and Yeats is looking at the swans on a lake in a natural environment. Also, Hughes is sort of looking at the relationships between people. There's elements of class differences, there's elements of relationships and the way people relate to one another, whereas Yeats is very much kind of caught in the mind of one speaker. It doesn't really have anything to say about relationships, about society, about culture. It's just looking at sort of the effect of aging, change, growth, the real world on sort of the mindset of one person. So it's very kind of a lonely poem, whereas Hughes's poem is lonely in a different way, where it's sort of one person surrounded by people, and he's looking at the way that those people interact. And he's using the imagery of trees and this extended simile of trees losing their leaves to kind of talk about how some relationships sort of end in disaster and leave one person sort of broken and alone. Also, Hughes sort of has a little bit more of a definite ending, where he's looking at sort of the relationship is going to end. You know, the trees are going to be left stripped and bare, and their only love is going to be sort of the cold winter and sort of the harsh reality of things. Whereas Yeats is a little more indefinite. He sort of says, maybe other people could enjoy the swans, maybe I'll just wake up one day and the swans won't be there, what will I do then? It's a little bit more up in the air, and he doesn't really sort of arrive at a conclusion. It's sort of this sense of sort of, well, I need to figure out what I'm going to do once the swans aren't there anymore. Like, what will that leave me with this thing that I was so in love with in my younger years? When that's gone, what do I have left? You know, and there's lots of questions. You know, the poem ends on a question because he genuinely isn't sure what he's going to do. And I think it's just interesting to see how these two poems are sort of talking about similar things, but in very different ways and with different tools at their disposal. They both have sort of musical, lyrical qualities, but they both create their imagery in different ways. Hughes is very, he likes the contrast between sort of the beautiful, elegant richness of autumn and then the brutal emptiness of winter. Whereas Yeats is more about the pastoral setting is beautiful, and that doesn't change. It's still beautiful at the end, but it's like the speaker has this filter over his eyes, and it's affecting his ability to connect with that. So I don't know, these two poems are really great, and there's lots of different ways we can dig into this. There's a lot of sort of really nitty-gritty things you could dive into. One thing I really like about the Hughes poem is that at the end, when it switches into kind of winter mode, he uses lots of alliteration, and you've got lots of those repeated sounds, and it's almost like you're being, you know, buffeted and cut. I especially like where he says, you know, winter winds and bodies bare, and then sharp sleet stung. You've got SSSS. It's very, you know, aggressive. Caresses of cold. You've got that C sound again and again, and so you've got this sort of change in the feel of it, because the first half of the Hughes poem is very kind of flowing and elegant, and the second part is very jagged and angry, and I really like that. With the Yeats poem, I really like how he has this sort of rhyme scheme that is sort of remains constant throughout, as if it's a song, but the rhythm of each stanza is different. He goes into sort of, each stanza sort of feels like it's a completely different thought. And in the rhyme, there's also a few, they look like slant rhymes, or they don't seem like they actually rhyme. But again, Yeats was Irish, and he had a very strong Irish accent. And so I feel like when he read this, if he ever read it, they would rhyme because of the way his accent was. So sometimes when you're looking at slant rhymes, you want to be aware of the voice of the speaker, because there's some poems where it rhymes because of the accent, and there's other times where there's a slant rhyme because they intentionally want that kind of slight disconnect between the two words that don't quite rhyme. But, you know, it's hard to tell. But these are great poems, and I hope you will take time to sort of read through them again after this and just sort of meditate on sort of what what they mean to you. My question for you would be, when you read these two poems, which of the two speakers do you feel like you relate to more? Which one seems like they're addressing issues or ideas that sort of speak to you as a person more? What can you relate to more, I guess, is the question. Because that's why we read poems. We don't just read it to be like, all right, I've gotten to the end, I've read the poem, there, it's done. We read poems because poems are, it's like a filter, and we pour our whole identity through this filter, and we see what little bits of us are left behind. So what speaks to us, what inspires us, what scares us, what makes us want to kind of dig in more. Of the two poems also, which poet do you think you'd be more inclined to read more of their work? Which one sort of spoke to you and makes you want to check out more of their poems? That's an interesting question as well. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.